Alright, so I had an overwhelming amount of requests to make a tutorial on how to create the sniper scope that I used in the last gunmetal update video. So it's actually pretty simple. There's only about four things you have to do. And the first I'd say is just to create a few spheres and just make sure that you remove the sphere collider component of it. And then you just want to scale it down to the least minimal width that you can get to. So just make it as skinny as you can. And then scale it down to the size of a lens that would fit in the scope. And I'm assuming that you already have your sniper rifle set up with the scope on top or the scope attachment where you know it's going to go. So I'm going to go ahead and center this in the area of the scope that I want it to be and scale it down. And we're going to move it back and position it. Alright, just make sure it's not coming out the sides. Scale it down. So we're going to have about three or four separate spheres here overlapping each other, depending on how much detail you want. So I already have mine set up here in my hierarchy. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this sphere because you get the basic idea of how that gets there. And I have a sphere that says, I just renamed it to lens. And this is the base lens that you see before everything else is rendered behind it. And I'm just going to toggle that off for now. I have the glass, which actually has our camera render texture on it, which I'll get to in a second. And then I have the actual crosshair texture. As you can see there, it's kind of hard to see. And then I have a simple dirt decal, which is, it's kind of hard to tell what's there, but it's not super important. That's just for a little bit of added detail. Let's just focus on the main parts of the scope for now. So you're going to want to first add about 3 different spheres, and you're going to want the crosshair texture sphere to be in front of all the other ones. So you're going to want to have a pre-made texture already that kind of looks like this. You're going to want to have some kind of texture that looks like this kind of scope. It doesn't have to be the same, it just has to have the basic crosshair, has to be transparent PNG, and then it needs to be an unlit cutout. Mine is an HDRP, so the material is weird, but make sure the material on that sphere for the crosshair is unlit cutout, and you can enable alpha cutoff so that you get rid of that white and you don't have a strange looking whiteness around your crosshair. Once you've done that, you're going to have the crosshair in the middle of the gun where you want it to be placed. And then I'm just going to toggle that off real quick. So you have that part. And then you're going to want to add another sphere behind that. And it's just going to look like a plain white sphere at this point. And what you're going to want to do is create a new material that just accepts a random texture. And this can work with any standard Unity material. Mine just look different because I'm using HDRP, as I said earlier. So after that step, you're going to have a blank white sphere behind a crosshair, and it's going to look somewhat weird. That's okay, that's what we want. So you're going to have something that looks kind of like this, but it's not going to have this rendered behind it. It's just going to be white. And to fix that, you're going to want to add a camera. And the camera is going to go right in front of the scope. Or, you could put it further down the scope near the barrel. It doesn't matter. As long as it's where you want it in front of the scope. If it's behind it, you're going to be rendering inside and back of the scope. We don't want that. So I already went ahead and put mine in front of the scope, and this is all under the hierarchy of the weapon so that it moves, or under the scope, whatever you want. And I also adjusted the field of view so that is somewhat zoomed in. You want it to be a zoomed in field of view on that camera. That's how you get the zoomed in scope effect. And this could all should be changed by a script where you have the scroll wheel. That's how you do zoom in, zoom out. But for now, I'm just going to leave it at a value of about 14. It's a pretty good zoom in. All right, so we have our camera. And for now, it's not going to be doing anything because we haven't made a render texture for it yet. And that's in the output settings here of the camera object. So to do that, we're going to go to our project tab. And you can go anywhere you want. It doesn't really matter. Just some random folder somewhere. Put it in assets. You're going to go to create. All the way down. Fine, there it is. Render texture. And just call it whatever you want. Scope, doesn't matter. And what we're going to do is assign that render texture to the camera right here. And target texture, you assign scope or whatever you just created. And that camera will now be outputting to that texture what it's seeing. And then what you can do is put that material or that render texture into a material and then put that material on the sphere glass lens that we have behind our crosshair in the scope. So real quick, I'm just going to make a new material. There it is. Call this scope. I'm going to go to the glass sphere, which is behind our crosshair, so that it doesn't render over it. And then I'm going to go ahead and assign my new material. Called scope. And then in that material, we're going to change the input, the color, to our scope render texture. Boom. And now we have the texture being rendered onto our scope here. And that's exactly what we want. All right, so once you've adjusted all the color settings and you have it looking how you want, and it matches everything else, you're going to want to add some more spheres, I'd say in front of the crosshair, not behind it like the render texture. Like I did here with this dirt lens, it adds a little bit of extra detail. You can really see, you know, some dirt on the lens, some scratches, and I made sure to leave some gloss on this actually, so that it's got a little bit of detail to it, like it's actually a lens. But yeah, that about does it. That's all you really need to add the sniper scope. What you can also do is add another sphere in front of everything else, like I did here, which is the base lens. This is what you see before you zoom in. And how you go from this to this is I just added a line in one of my scripts where it toggles, you know, the aim down sights or whatever. And I just made it call an animation on this animator on this lens that turns the transparency. The animation, you know, when it gets called, it turns the transparency from 100 down to 0 when you aim down the sight, and then when you release aiming, it turns it all the way back up, and you get a nice fade going in between your scope. And all you need to do for that is just add an animator to your object, create a simple animation where you add the property of the alpha for the material, and then just crossfade between it, and then call that animation at the part of your script where you want, and it'll just fade in and out. Or you could just leave it off and have the sniper scope and crosshair showing while you're playing, which is fine too. But for me, I have it working like this. So yeah, let's go try it. All right, so we have our sniper scope. When we zoom in, for me, it does that little crossfade. For you guys, it might not do that. You might just have the simple, you know, scope up here. But it should look exactly like this. You have some decal on it, or maybe not, you just have the plain lens, but it's zoomed in. It should be centered. You can test it. Yep, perfectly centered. It should line up and it's zoomed in. You're also going to have to adjust your aim down sight settings for the gun to center the scope perfectly on your screen, but this will get the zoom in feature working right, and it'll also have the crosshair inside the scope, so it gives a more natural feel. But yeah, that should do it. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comments or join the Discord and ask them there.